Well, I've been requested to do some videos on concativity and maxima and minimum points and inflection points and all the like that you normally see in your first semester of a calculus course. So I thought I would start doing them. But before we kind of go into the actual problems that you might see in your book, I just want to give you a broad intuition, because in calculus class, there are all these rules. When the second derivative is positive, you're concave this way. When the second derivative is negative, you're concave this way. And people memorize the rules and then they take the tests. And if they memorize it correctly, they do well on the test. And then they forget it. Maybe they memorize it again by the time of the final exam. But by the time they're 30 years old, they will have forgotten it. And that, frankly, is useless unless your whole goal is just to pass the exam. So I want to give you some intuition, and hopefully you will never forget this intuition. So when you're first learning calculus, there's much more to functions than what I'm going to do in this video, but there's kind of three types of interesting points on most of the curves we'll talk about. So let me draw a curve. Let's say the curve looks something like this. If this is the x-axis, that's too thick. That's the y-axis. The curve could look something like this. I don't know. Let me see. It could look like this. And so on, right? And if you have a curve like this, and you'll see all sorts of curves when you do your calculus, and because you have multiple degree polynomials, etc. What are the interesting points? Well, the interesting points tend to be when the slope is equal to 0. So in this, where does the slope equal 0? What are the interesting points here? Let me make sure I'm using the right tool. Right there, the slope is 0, right? Because if you were to take the tangent right there, it would look something like that. Right there, the slope is 0 as well, because if you took the tangent, it would look something like that. And then right there as well, the slope is 0. And the line, it really isn't a tangent. It crosses the graph. But as we can see, the graph kind of flattens out there. So these are the 3 points that you tend to deal with in your first semester calculus class when you're graphing and looking for extrema. And this is called a maximum. And in this case, it's a local maxima. If this was the highest point for the entire function, it would be a global maximum. This is a local minima. And if it was if it was the lowest point of the entire graph, which the way I drew it, maybe this graph keeps going up like that and keeps going up like this. So this would be the global minimum point. And this is called an inflection point, because it's neither a maximum or minimum, but you kind of see that the graph kind of inflects. So let's study them a little bit more and see if we can get a little intuition on what happens to the graph, the first derivative, and the second derivative at each of these points. So let's start with a maximum point, because maybe that's, well, actually, let's start with a minimum point, because that's what we see the most. When we just studied y equals x squared or regular parabolas, that was the most common thing we saw. And then, of course, if we have a negative of a parabola, it becomes like that. But anyway, let's study a minimum point where the graph is concave upward. So let's say we have a point like this. So that's the graph of the function, right? Let me I don't know what that is. That's f of x. So what is happening to the slope as we go from, roughly from here to there? Well, let's try a few points and see if we can, by drawing the tangent lines, we get an intuition for the slope. So let's see. If I pick this point just randomly, the slope looks something like that. Right, I'm trying to do a tangent. If I take this point, I'm just moving to the right a little bit. I'm just increasing my x value. The slope will look something like that. So it's negative here, but if you look here, the slope is less negative, right? The slope is less negative there. And then if we go to the minimum point right there, the slope flattens out. Right? And so, of course, the derivative there would be 0. And then as we pass that point, what happens? Well, here, the slope is increasing a little bit more. And now the slope is actually positive, right? So the slope was negative, less negative, 0, a little positive, and then when we go here, it goes more positive. More positive. So let's see if we can graph that. Let's see if we can, just to get an intuition. Obviously, I haven't written any numbers down, so we don't know what the exact value of the slope is. So what does the slope look like? So here it's really negative. So the slope is going to be something really negative here. I'm just picking a random point. And then at this point right here, it was less negative. So the slope is going to be less negative. And then here, roughly here, the slope is at 0. Right? The slope was 0, and then the slope gets a little bit more positive. And then over there, it gets a little bit more positive. So the slope if we were to actually graph the derivative of the function at that point, it would be an upward sloping. And so I'm assuming this is a second degree polynomial. If this was third degree, then this would actually be a curve. So the slope will actually look something like this. Right? And does that make sense? Well, sure. This, the graph of this could be y is equal to, I don't know, ax squared plus b. And then the derivative, or f of x is equal to ax squared plus b. And so the derivative of that, of course, would be, what is that? 2ax plus 0, right? So this would just be a line, and it actually goes through 0, 0. But it didn't have to. But hopefully that gives you a little intuition. But now let's move to the second derivative. So the slope of the slope. Let me draw it down here. The second derivative. My wife is coming home, so I have to finish these videos before she gets here. Otherwise, I have to continue it tomorrow. Let's see. She called 5 minutes ago, so I have to hurry. Anyway, so this is f prime prime of x, or the second derivative. So what's happening to the second derivative here? Well, the second derivative is just the slope of the derivative. So what's the slope? Well, it's just a constant. In this case, it's just a constant upward moving slope, right? So the second derivative, actually, if we were to just evaluate that, it would be 2a. So it's going to look something like this, and it's just going to be a constant number, and it's going to be positive, right? So in general, when people, when you study your extrema points and say whether it's a minimum or a maximum, etc., the way that you think about it is, well, if it's a minimum point like this, if it's a minimum point, what is happening to the slope around it? Well, the slope has to be constantly increasing, right? Even though, for example, as we go from here to here, the value of f of x is decreasing, the rate at which it's decreasing is getting less. So the slope is actually increasing. It's getting less and less negative, and then it increases even more. So you know you're at a minimum point when the slope is increasing. And similarly, you know that it's concave upwards when the second derivative is positive. So hopefully that helps you a little bit get the intuition of what happens when you're at a minimum point and you're concave upwards. Well, what happens when you have the opposite? Well, pretty much everything becomes the opposite. Let's say that this is your curve. I don't know, and this is the x-axis. If that's your curve, well, here you have a very high slope. Then your slope becomes a little bit less. Then it becomes 0. Then it becomes a little bit more negative. Then it becomes more negative, right? And then it goes more negative. The rate of the slope becomes more and more negative the whole time that we're kind of going through this maximum point or this concave downward. So what will the slope look like? Well, in this example, if I were to draw the derivative, the slope is going to look something like this, right? Because back here, the slope is actually a really high number. It's going to be up here. And then as we get close, as we move further and further, increasing values of x, the slope decreases. It becomes 0 right around here. And then it just keeps decreasing. And then similarly, if we were to draw the second derivative, what will that look like? Well, the second derivative is just going to be the slope of this function. So it's just going to be a negative number if we assume that this is constant. So if this is the x-axis, the second derivative is going to be something like that. It's going to be some negative number. I'm assuming this is 0, 0. Anyway, I'm about to run out of, well, I'm not about to run out of time, but I think I don't want to rush it. So that's the maximum and minimum points. And in the next video, I'll give you a little intuition on what happens with inflection points. And then we will do a bunch of examples that you will normally see in a calculus textbook. But I just wanted to do this for you because there's nothing magical about a lot of the rules that you will learn. Where they say, oh, you take the second derivative, and if the second derivative is positive, it's concave upwards, and if the second derivative is negative, it's concave downwards, and you might fill your brain with all of these memorizations. But it's hopefully, if you think about it this way, fairly intuitive. And it hopefully should be fairly intuitive that whenever the first derivative is 0, your slope is 0, and you're at a point that is interesting, at least in this context. But anyway, I will do the next video on inflection points, and then I will do a bunch of actual problems. See you soon.